Right, today we're going to lesson number 10 from the SD for TA, the unanswered questions, a study of the undeclared or indetermined or indeterminate thesis. Thesis means ideas. This topic is a very important topic in the philosophy of Buddhism, in the Buddha's teaching, because asking the right questions is very important in any religion, especially Buddhism, because if you ask the wrong questions, you never get any good answers. And worse than that, this kind of questions, the wrong question, will lead us, to put it in a proverbial way, on a wild goose chase. In other words, you will never get the benefit of the practice, the training, purpose of Buddhism, for example. So let us limit our talks to say just Buddhism, which is easier for us and also more useful. If we are really interested in Buddhism, what are we really talking about? We're talking about personal development. We're talking about how to be happy, how to be at peace, and above all, how to be free from suffering in this life itself. Or, as we usually say, how to awaken in this life. So when you ask the right questions, you get the right answers. In fact, you can say that the answers are already there in the questions when they are rightly put. So here we have this understanding on the nature of questions. Because the idea of asking questions, the idea of practicing Buddhism, is not just to know things. There's a lot of information we have today available in so many ways, through books, through all kinds of courses, and of course through the internet. And no one is getting awakened through this kind of information. In fact, this kind of information even hinders our progress. It makes us more difficult to understand Buddhism, much less to understand ourselves. So in other words, all this information, they can be helpful, of course, if you know how to use them well, but not when we talk about meditation, when we talk about calming the mind, when we talk about awakening, because that is another story, so to speak. Because when we do meditation, we have to learn to let go of all these ideas so that our minds are at peace. But of course, here is where we are begging the question. In other words, we have not really solved the problem, because we do have thoughts, we do have ideas, we do have a lot of information on Buddhism. So what do we do with them? So this is where we learn to ask the right questions. We learn to ask ourselves what is necessary for personal development, for spiritual cultivation, and what is not. So here there are certain questions, for example, the Buddha will never answer. And these are called the 10 questions. We will go into the details in the next talk, in the next study. Today we'll focus something like by way of introduction. So these 10 questions are not very helpful. They are very speculative, discussing about the nature of the universe, nature of life and death, and so on, which are not helpful in our efforts to calm the mind. Of course, we always need to question. At first, we ask the wrong questions, and slowly we learn to correct our questions, focus our questions, and then we become better and better in asking the right questions. And in religion, we need to ask a lot of questions, because most religions tend to have a set of ideas, very fixed ideas, and you're supposed to believe in them. And if you don't, then of course you might not be able to be a member of the group and so on. But in Buddhism, it's very different. Yes, we do have sets of teachings, but they're more like instructions. Let's say you're learning to drive a car, then you need a highway code. Those are like the precepts, the 5 precepts and so on. And then you need to have a coach to teach you. That's like a meditation teacher. And then you have to practice it yourself. That's like cultivating wisdom. So it's a hands-on kind of thing. So Buddhism is very hands-on. Of course, if you're talking about Buddhist training, not Buddhism as a religion. That is another different story. So this is where an organized religion sometimes can be its own hindrance, especially in terms of meditation. Because if you see religion today, it has become like an empire, especially a big religion. And if it is an empire, you have an emperor, like a leader, a very powerful person, could be imaginary, like a god figure. And there is a center of power, a group of people running everything. And of course, there's a code of inviolable laws, and you have to follow those laws of teaching. Someday you might even have to sign a contract and to join a particular group, a religious group. And of course, there are a body of enforcers, people who make sure you keep to the rules. Otherwise, you get thrown out of the group, and so on, or thrown out of the tribe. Or we can imagine religion today like a big machine, machinery, haunted by a ghost. As I said, ghost in a machine. So, and this ghost thrives on the unthinking parts, the cogs and the wheels, slavishly, piously turning, working together to make this machine work without any questions. Some religion discourages from asking questions. They say, well, it's good enough to believe. Believe that you might know. But in Buddhism, we say, that's wrong. You should know that you might believe. If we say we believe that we might know, that means we simply blindly accept something, turn that into something real, but that's virtual reality. On the other hand, in Buddhism, we tell ourselves, look around, what do you see, question yourself, and slowly we learn bit by bit. So it's a very different way of looking at the world, looking at ourselves. In many ways, the Buddhist way of questioning is much safer, because we go step by step, we ask questions, discuss them, and build up our answers from the different questions that we ask. So you have two different ways of looking at this topic at hand. One is a religious way, if you like. Nowadays, when you talk about religion, religiosity, being religious, very often we think of rituals, buildings where people go to worship, doing things in a group together, and for most people that's about it. But then there is spirituality. Spirituality comes from the word spirit. That means we need to understand the meaning of what we have taken up, or what we have decided to practice. You've got the meaning, you have the purpose. Right? So here we can briefly say, when we talk about the meaning, is what do you see all around you? What do you see in life? What is it? What's the meaning of all these things that you see around you? We see there is unsatisfactoriness. Things are not perfect. There is pain, suffering. This is the first noble truth, of course. And then also, if there is this fact, there is also the cause or arising of it. That's the second noble truth. So these two constitute the meaning of life. Then you have the purpose of life, or the purpose of Buddhism. This is formulated in the third and fourth noble truths. The purpose of being a Buddhist, the purpose of life, is to attain awakening, to grow and attain awakening, to be free from suffering. Then the fourth noble truth is the way towards this awakening. So there you have meaning and purpose of life. So in other words, when we talk about spirituality, we're talking about this meaning and purpose of Buddhism. And when we talk about Buddhism, we're talking about life itself. You cannot separate the two. So it is wrong to ask questions like, what can Buddhism do for me? If I become a Buddhist, what can Buddhism do for me? Well, we can say nothing. Nothing at all. Right? because that's a wrong question. It's a very selfish question even. Because you can't separate yourself from Buddhism. So if you put this question more rightly, how can we rectify this question? Well, we can ask something like, what can I do for myself as a Buddhist? What can I do for myself? Well, that's more meaningful, more effective, more proactive, if you like. And it's part of Buddhist training. It's a very important part of Buddhist training. For example, if you ask, what can I do for myself? Of course, the very first thing is we have to understand the nature of our body, our five senses. Our five senses are like five phones ringing all the time, and we have to answer them, so it can become very stressful, very difficult. So we have to discipline this five senses. And at the right time, we would like a break, a holiday from the five senses, so that we don't have to run after them, thinking, deciding, all kinds of reactions and decisions to make about them. So we call it a holiday. The word holiday originally meant holy day. It's a day you dedicate yourself, to the spirit, to a rest, a good rest, to re-energize yourself, to be truly happy for yourself. But then in Buddhism, disciplining our bodies is the basis for mental training. That's the sixth sense. We train our minds so that we understand how we think, how we feel. And from there we refine our mind, our attitudes, to let go of defilements, let go of negative thoughts, and so on. So this is the area of mental cultivation, otherwise known as meditation. So in other words, if you have a cultivated body, cultivated mind working together, we have calm and clarity. The mind becomes calm and clear. Wisdom will arise. Wisdom means you know the true nature of yourself and of life. And because of that, you are more free and more happy. So here again, we're asking the right questions. Right? So when we ask the right questions, what kind of questions, what do we ask about? One way of looking at this very interesting point is we can say we should ask questions about the Four Noble Truths, which helps us to understand ourselves better, understand the nature of life, if you like. Almost all of us know what the First Noble Truth is. We say, oh yeah, the First Noble Truth is about suffering. But what does it mean? Now we can look at the Four Noble Truths here in terms of what is called the grammar of spirituality. We can use just the pronouns today. Who, what, when, how, why, and so on. Yeah? Because these are the parts of speech, if you like, that sometimes can create the problems. But we understand them, then we can solve the problem. So here, for example, when we talk about the First Noble Truth, we accept the fact that there is suffering, there is unsatisfactoriness, something is missing in our lives. What is this suffering? It is defined by the way we see ourselves. And we see the world as what, when, and who. And these are three troubling words. We tend to see the world as what, when, and who. In other words, in our daily language, these are three words or three terms, English terms that we use. They are like pronouns or prepositions, which we often use when we talk with people. But they create problems. For example, if you say, what is this? Then you assume that it is a thing, a what. That means it does not change. It's a fixed thing. So this is the first thing we have to correct. Of course, we can't remove the word what or ban it, but we can redefine it, understand. When you say, what is this? This what? For example, I say, what is this on my table? We say, it's a cup. But what is a cup? It is something we use to put water in it. It can break. So in other words, this water, the word cup, contains many words, many ideas that describe it. So a cup is not a thing. A cup is an event. A cup is a process. And once we begin to understand things like that, what has a new meaning to us. So when someone says, what is that? And we think, oh yes, this is a process. This is an event. This is impermanent. So this is one way of looking at it. Then we tend to also ask, when? When did this happen? When did you do this? When do you want to do that? So when we use the word when, we think of the past or the future. We never think of the present when we say when. It's always the past or the future. For example, we say, when I was young, when I was so many years old. Or we can look into the future and say, when I grow up, when I grow old, when whatever happens, right? So when we use when, we always talk about the past or the future, never the present. So here, we have to remember this, that when we say when, we are purely imagining something in terms of time. So we cannot take it too seriously, in other words, in a sense of how true they are. You got to give it some space. For example, our past memories is not always correct. Sometimes we forget the details and we add in new details. And when we talk about the future, we say, oh, when I grow old, this is what I'm going to do. But when the actual time comes, we change our minds. Or we find that those things that we get in the future are not really satisfying after all. So when is very tricky. It never deals with the present moment. So we have to deal with right now. What's going on here? And deal with it. Not when, in the past or in the future. Right now. Beyond when, so to speak. Then is another troubling word, the most troubling word. We say who. If something goes wrong, we say, who did this? We're trying to fault somebody, we're trying to blame somebody. But who? When you say who, we think there's a person, and we think, oh, this person, is like that, cannot change, we say. There's no such person. I mean, we really think carefully, who in the world is a person who cannot change? Maybe an idea of that person, yes, we think that person cannot change. But the person has already changed. Maybe the person is dead and gone. Now, we wouldn't like people to think of us as someone who cannot change. Or, yeah, maybe sometimes we might have the wrong notion that, oh, I'm someone who does not change. And then later, as the years pass, you find you do change after all. Like it or not, we physically change, mentally also we change. In fact, we're changing our opinions all the time, over time. If you look at yourself, you examine yourself. Many years ago, before you knew Buddhism, you had one kind of set of ideas. And when you begin to study Buddhism, your ideas begin to change. And then now, so many things, so many ideas have changed in our lives. So you can see this projection, this trajectory. In other words, even now as we study Buddhism, we've got to keep an open mind. We study new things about Buddhism, the windows are opening more broadly, we can see outside more clearly. So Buddhism is a wonderful adventure in spirituality towards awakening. In other words, if we do not get stuck with a way of looking at something, for example, we just look at the window panel, we say, oh, there's a bug there or something, and then we miss the real view. And we've got to go on looking, and we see the scenery changing. We see morning coming, midday, sunset, the seasons, people coming, people going through the window. So in other words, Buddhism is teaching us so many things. And we let go of one idea, we learn another one. We let go of that idea, another one. So the ideas become clearer and clearer, they begin to fit together, and we feel so happy as a result of this knowing. So this is when we do not talk in terms of who has a unchanging person. We can use who, but we must understand all this, that we are simply using conventional language to refer to someone, but this person can change. This person is impermanent. So this is the reflection we must do, using all these pronouns and prepositions and words in the grammar of spirituality. And of course, you have the I, right? All this I is just a convenient word we use to refer to this body and mind that is talking, right? So again, this I is impermanent. You have to reflect on all this. Everything changed, right? Our body change, our feelings change, our perception, how we see things also change, our consciousness changing all the time. And we create actions, formations, body, speech and mind, it also change. Everything that exists must change. If we say something exists, even the God idea is God must change, otherwise it can't exist. There's no such thing. Then the second noble truth. The second noble truth is the cause or arising of suffering, which is we normally know as craving. So here again, how can we reflect on this second noble truth? By asking the right questions, or understanding the questions. Of course, in the second noble truth, the key word there is why. Why is there suffering, right? So we have to examine why. Now, when you ask why, you are looking for causes and conditions. Yes, reasons. But reasons is how we see things, how we explain things, in our own way of looking at things, or someone else's way of looking at things. So reasoning need not be the same for everyone. Two different persons have two ways of reasoning. So it can be very difficult sometimes when we talk to other people with different kinds of reasoning. Causes and conditions, on the other hand, are more natural, so they are more likely to be the same. So when we look at something, when something happens, something goes wrong, something didn't turn out right, we try to blame someone. We go back to the first noble truth, suffering. It doesn't help there. So we got to re-examine the why. The why, there is no one person responsible for this problem. Yes, that person may be the key person that made something bad happen, but the reality is there are many other supporting conditions. So we rather blame the conditions than any one person, in other words. So if we really want to solve problems, we need to look at the conditions that brought about this situation, this event, this result. This is how we reflect on why. So when we talk about why suffering arises, we talk about conditions. Another important question here is how. How? How talks more about method, about, again here you see cause and effects working together. It also means what can we do about this? If what do I do will make something good happen. Of course, in this case, we don't want to do something bad happening. How do I get rid of suffering? How do I get rid of craving? Right? If you say, how do I get rid of suffering? Your teacher might say, you got to get rid of craving first. Then you ask, how do I get rid of craving? Then your teacher might say, get rid of thinking. How do I get rid of thinking? Then you say, you're asking all very interesting, all the right questions. How do you get rid of thinking? You have to learn to meditate. That's to answer it very simply for the time being. So basically, we never think in terms of a thing as something's fixed. We talk about conditions, and conditions change. So we want to study the patterns of change so that we can use a helpful pattern of change that will benefit us, make us wiser, more peaceful and happier, more free from suffering. Then we come to the third noble truth. The third noble truth, as you know, is the happy one, it's called nirvana. Nirvana, ending of all suffering. Now this is the most difficult topic to talk about. It's impossible to really, actually talk about nirvana, because whatever we can say is not nirvana. So here we're just discussing some ideas so that we have some understanding what nirvana is not. And from there we can have understanding, perhaps some idea what nirvana is like, that can help us live our lives meaningfully, purposefully. So we can say that when nirvana is concerned, there's no who, no what, no when, no how. It's beyond time and space, beyond any ideas of entity. That's one way of understanding nirvana. Or in a word, we say nirvana is unconditioned, without conditions. Conditions bring about suffering, because conditions change all the time, and we can never stop that change. We can never say, stop, this is what I want. And ironically, if things don't change, you can't enjoy them either. So you're caught in a sort of a double bind. Like it or not, that's the way it is. Whereas nirvana, no conditions. A simple idea to understand what nirvana is. Let's say you're very angry, very upset about something went wrong, or something you thought went wrong. So it's actually your thought that's making you unhappy and suffering. And then somebody told you that everything was all right, nothing bad happened really. So when you realize that, you're happy. So what caused the suffering? It's the way we think. So nirvana, in a sense, in a simple way, very, very simple way of looking at it, is when your anger is gone, when all the stress is gone, and that moment you felt so good, so free, that moment of release can help you to understand what nirvana is. You can extend the kind of idea of joy and peace and freedom, free of conditions, something like that, and that's nirvana. So we are still talking about the grammar of suffering. We come to the last one, the fourth noble truth, the way out of suffering, the path leading to nirvana. Of course, here the keyword is how. How do we do it, right? Of course, just asking how is not enough here. So this is where the questioning has to stop. Or rather, the questioning must be translated into actions. Into actions of the body and speech, actions of the mind, and action of wisdom, the three trainings. So to be a Buddhist means you go through a self-undertaking. You make an effort. The word effort is very important in Buddhism. Number one, to bring peace to your body first. Your body, your speech. And the next is to bring peace to your mind. And then comes this wonderful, peaceful understanding called wisdom. So there you are, the four noble truths in terms of who, what, when, why, how, and so on. So you can see here we're using language. Language is what can be enlightening as well as confusing. Sometimes you hear people, religious people, talk about things, people get very angry, and they get together and destroy people of other religions, destroy property, that's what they say. So it's not really the religion that's doing this, it's the misuse of language, misunderstanding of language. So it's helpful for us to understand the nature of language. They're just words, they are conditioned words with meanings that we give them, and suddenly we put the words together in such a way, we can feel happy, we put another way, you feel sad. It's all conditioned words, conditioning. When we understand this, then we are less likely to be trapped by language. Someone scolds us, someone tells us some words, we don't like those words. Why? Because in our culture, those words means bad, or those words means we look down on you. But then we can say, I don't accept the meaning of such words. So you won't get angry, even though people use those kinds of words with you, because you don't accept the meaning of those words, and you're calm and happy. For example, if I were to scold you in Russian, it makes no difference to you. You don't know what I'm talking about unless you're Russian. Or you know Russian. So in other words, it's our own mind that makes us upset. So if you do not have that trigger, or you don't have the lightning rod, the lightning can't strike you. So this is how we learn not to get upset. By not playing along. Of course, you might say, wow, that's tough, isn't it? Alright, then the Buddha says there is a way to help you. Do loving kindness. May I be well, may I be happy, may you be well, may you be happy, may everyone be well and happy. Now you go on thinking like that, then you push away negative thoughts. So your mind is happy, whoever's in front of you, whatever's happening in front of you, you look at it with unconditional acceptance. You accept things just as they are, and you work things from there. So, when you study Buddhism, of course, you have to understand the nature of language. I'm talking about Buddhism in English. Many people study Buddhism in English. There's so many books in English. So we have to make sure we know our English well enough. You must take the trouble to look up meanings of words that you don't understand. Never assume the meaning of the words, right? So that we have a clearer picture of what the writer is trying to say, what the sutta is trying to say. And the suttas are in Pali, sometimes Sanskrit. So again, it's good to know what these basic terms are. Pali is not difficult to learn because Pali is not a dead language. Please don't use that word because we use Pali a lot in Buddhism. It's a sacred language. There's a big difference. A dead language means a language nobody speaks anymore. Nobody uses it. That's a dead language. But we use Pali. We use Sanskrit. Right? So it's a living language. Pali is a sacred language. It's the sacred language of early Buddhism. The Buddha did not speak Pali. We do not know what language the Buddha spoke. He spoke many languages, I suppose, dialects. The Pali is one of those dialects which was used by a group of monks, probably south west of where the Buddha lived, in Buddha land, if you like, the Holy Land. And they use this language to preserve the Buddha's teachings. It's like using Hokkien or Cantonese to, let's say, to preserve Buddhism. And you find that sometimes the dialect is limited to certain words which the dialect cannot convey. So you find in Pali sometimes they adopt and adapt words from other dialects, even Sanskrit. Right? So we call it Pali. It preserves the early teachings of the Buddha. So when we use English, you must know that English has a cultural baggage. It's a Western language, heavily influenced by Judeo-Christianity, so we must be aware of that. And of course Western philosophy also. What does this mean? It means, for example, when we use words, we must redefine it. If you write an essay, you must take the trouble to say, okay, to me this is what I mean by this word. For example, Western scholars for many decades, even centuries, they like to use the word enlightened, right? Because there is a period in the Western philosophy, British philosophy especially, called the Enlightenment. So they thought, wow, Buddhism is so liberating, so we might as well describe the Buddha's Bodhi as enlightenment. But scholars who know better today try not to use the word enlightenment. They rather use the word closer to the word Bodhi. Bodhi means understanding, so they use the word awakening, which is closer to the word Bodhi. So these are things which helps if we are aware of them. Of course, even if someone will come to me and use the word enlightenment, I understand what the person is trying to say. But I also need to know how the person understands by the word enlightenment. And from there, we might have a useful dialogue. So in other words, we are not just discussing words here, we are discussing meanings and usages of words. Sometimes a person may say a word, but to him the meaning is different from what I'm thinking. Or sometimes a person may use the right word, but the way the person uses it, he's not happy with the word, so we've got to find out why. So these are the dynamics of language when we talk about Buddhism, religion. So if we use words, we use languages, there are three important phases or stages that we must be aware of, which help us to understand nature of language, use language effectively, to understand Buddhism, to teach Buddhism, right? The first is a very elementary level. We should at least make an effort to understand the meaning and usage of English and Western terms, because sometimes some of these words have very specific ideas and we should not use them. Certain words are very Christian, for example, like resurrection. We are unlikely to use such words in Buddhism. We don't have that kind of idea in Buddhism. Then the word rebirth is troubling. I mean, this punabhava. We use words like reincarnation. Now, reincarnation is not an exact word. It's not exactly wrong, but it's not exact, because reincarnate means to get into a body again. But you know, when we talk about rebirth in Buddhism, it's not always a bodily rebirth. So we can say reincarnate into a human being, which is all right. We can, in a sense, say reincarnate into any of those beings in the sense world. But even then, if we say reincarnate into a preta, it does create some problem, because although a preta belongs, the hungry ghost belongs to the sense world, the preta doesn't have a physical body like ours. So this is where, in that case, it's best to avoid words like reincarnation. Rebirth, reborn, is a more general term, a neutral term, which reflects the situation better. So these are things we need to study, examine, and then use it, and then see what's the effect of the words. Sometimes we have words which are anglicized. In other words, they are Pali or Sanskrit. Normally it's a Sanskrit words and terms that are anglicized. In that case, you can use those words. And we have many of them. For example, we have the word Arahat, Bodhisattva, Buddha, Dharma, Dhyana, Karma, and so on, words like that. Of course, again here, when we use such words, you must make sure what you're talking about. For example, in my writings, I will say, I use all these words in the sense of the early Buddhism, not in the Mahayana sense, for example. Right? So you've got to define your terms again here. So when they're anglicized words, use them. They're not actually Sanskrit words, but although they're borrowed from Sanskrit, but they become English. So if there are anglicized words, they're as good as English words. So it's easier to use them because the dictionaries will define them. And again, you've got to examine the dictionary definitions. They're not always correct. They might be out of date. So even dictionaries update their definitions. You and I are the living dictionary. We are the ones who define these terms, and the dictionaries follow. So we must define our terms correctly. Thirdly, we talk to a group of people, to the audience, and we have to understand what this audience, what is our level of understanding. Right? Of course, if they have a good level of understanding, it is good to use the original Pali terms or Indian terms. That helps them to understand the teaching better. For example, there's one scholar who found difficulty in translating the word asava, so he used the word asava, the inflows, or what you can also say as outflows, as cankers and so on. So this is where you can choose to use the Pali words, if you like. But the problem is people who are not familiar with Pali words, they will not know what the meaning is. For example, for the word asava, which is a very important concept in Buddhism, a very difficult one, because the Pali word is polysemic, it has many meanings. So I use asava in this connection in terms of what brings suffering, and I translate as influx or influxes in the plural, because asavas are things that flow through our senses into our being, and then we make sense of these things, and then we create suffering for ourselves. So you've got to define your terms in other words. Now we come to another very interesting area, on what are called the Chatukoti or Chatuskoti, the tetralemma, or the four alternatives, the four possible states of truth, here again we have some difficulties with Western learning, but hopefully I can clarify a few things here. The trilemma or the four alternatives are a very common set of way of talking about truth in the Buddha's time in Indian philosophy, and not found in Western philosophy, which is based mostly on Aristotle's way of thinking. Aristotle teaches of duality. To him, something's either true or not true. It's either black or white, only two. A kind of a binary system. And based on this binary system, you get the computers, you get mathematics, right? So it's basically a duality. But in Indian philosophy, in Buddhist philosophy, we say that it is possible to talk of truth or reality in four ways. Of course, you put into logical, modern Western logic, you say it can be P, not P, both P and not P, neither P nor not P. In simple English, P means something exists. For example, there is this cup, okay? Very simple fact, first thing. Or this is a person, or I'm a person. Not P, that means it doesn't exist, okay? Let's say the cup broke, so there's no more cup there, right? Or I can say, this is not a cup, it's a table, right? The table is not a cup. So, in other words, I'm saying it putting it in a negative way, not something, not P. Or I can say both, it is both P and not P. So, for example, we say it's a person and yet not a person. Meaning, an unconscious person, for example, someone who has fainted, it's not really a person, he cannot sign documents. You don't even know his name. Let's say you see a stranger on the roadside, right? And he has no documents on him, so he's not a person. Right? And yet, he's a human being, a person, yet not a person. Or you can say neither P nor not P. So, in other words, we are talking about something else, totally something which is not a person, maybe a table, right? So it may sound a little tricky at first, but if you listen carefully, it's not really that difficult. So I'm not going to go into details here, because you can read in this SD 48.10, especially in section 2, all those things about the law of identity, the law of non-contradiction, the law of excluded middle. These are all very important in Western logic. Just very simple point. Law of identity means a cup is a cup, right? You cannot say a cup is not a cup. This is Western philosophy, right? Non-contradiction, basically, in simple terms, it means you cannot have two truths at the same time. Either something is black or white. Something is true or false. You cannot say both true and false, right? So again, Western idea. Western logic based on Aristotle's idea. And there is the law of excluded middle. There is no third reality, in other words. Let's just keep it simple like that, right? You want more details, you can read that for yourself. So, how do the ancient Indians apply these four alternatives, or four alternative kinds of truth? Those ancient Indians, they're very curious about nature of life. The Buddha lived in a time where there was this very great intellectual ferment. People were asking all kinds of basic questions of life. Is there an afterlife? Right? So this is the P question. Or is there no afterlife? Or there is and there is not an afterlife? Or there is neither is nor is not afterlife. Right? So you have four ways of looking at things. And another set of questions I'd like to ask is about what happens when a saint dies. Like when the Buddha dies, an Arhat dies. Does he exist? That's P. Does he not exist? Not P. Or does he both exist and not exist? Right? P and not P. Or neither exist nor not exist. So you can imagine, right? First two are easy to understand, last two too tricky. So these four alternatives don't make sense in Aristotelian logic to the Westerners, right? Of course, if you look at all these four statements as logic, they don't make sense because they are not about logic. The point is, these four alternatives are not about logic, they're simply about statement of truths. And we should see it that way. Then we have no problem with logic and so on. Now, what is of special interest to us here is the most difficult one. It's number 4, the fourth alternative. Neither P nor not P. Now, this one is useful. If you understand this is useful to help us not to get caught in language tricks. You know, sometimes you might meet this Christian evangelist. They ask you, do you believe in God? Or don't you think God created the world? Right? So once you say God created the world, you find you are caught in a trick already. Even if you say, I don't believe in this, you still get caught. But there are more interesting and funnier versions of this. For example, if I ask you a question like this, do you think Martians are green? Do you think Martians are green? Whether you answer yes or no, you will be caught into admitting that Martians exist. If you say, oh yes, Martians are green, then of course you admit that you believe there are Martians. If you say no, Martians are not green, you also admit the fact that there are Martians. So you see, this is a trick question. So these are the kind of question the Buddha says it's double horn, a dilemma. He won't answer such question. He says it's a trick question. You have put a trick question, and I'm not going to answer that. So this is, in other words, to apply this fourth formula, we say it's neither. There are neither Martians nor are they green. There you are. You are not caught in this kind of language trick. Okay? When you have difficulty understanding me, just rewind the video, listen again. Or better, read this book, SD 48.10. Of course, there are funny ones, even more funny examples here. For example, if someone tells you, did you beat up somebody? Did you beat up your mother-in-law, for example? Answering yes or no can get yourself into trouble. So it's best to remain silent in this case. So remaining silent is another very important way of answering. And this is in volume 44, chapter 1, which I've just completed this morning actually. It's a very interesting follow-up to this chapter on unanswered questions. And that follow-up chapter is called The Silence in the Buddha, SD 44.1. This essay or rather this volume has just been completed, so we have not put it online yet. So if you want this, you have to email us, we'll send it to you. So here, in other words, the ancient Indian philosophers, Buddhist philosophers like Chandrakirti, he gives us some other examples. He says that sometimes you can have contradictions put together, like the horn of a rabbit. Rabbits don't have horns. Or he uses the example of the son of a barren woman. A barren woman cannot give birth to any child. So it doesn't make sense to say. I mean, you can say the phrase, but it doesn't make sense. So this is where neither are true. Yeah? In modern philosophy, we do have this idea. It is called Russell's teapot. This is a brilliant philosopher of the 20th century. He's a British philosopher, Bertrand Russell. He says, he introduced this idea, this argument, which has become famous, so it's named after him. It's called Russell's teapot, to kind of refute this God idea. He says that imagine that if I were to claim there's a teapot orbiting the sun somewhere in space between Earth and Mars, it is nonsensical for me to expect others to believe me. on the grounds that they cannot prove me wrong, right? So just because you cannot prove me wrong doesn't mean I'm right, right? So can you see this idea now, right? This teapot, I say there is a teapot moving around the sun, and it is orbiting around the sun between Earth and Mars, and it's very tiny, you can't see it. Now you can't prove me wrong, but that doesn't mean I'm right. So someone comes along and say, I believe in this God, He has created the world, nobody can see Him. But that doesn't mean He's right. That's Russell's teapot. It's a very interesting way of clarifying false statements, dishonest statements. Okay? So this is where, especially in religion, we must be honest and very careful to, when someone is hedging, in other words, avoiding the real issues. This is very common in God religions because it's one of the weakest ideas that we can find in religion. Because we can't prove it, nobody has seen God, right? There are many, many issues, and yet people want to believe in the God idea. Why? Because it is powerful, it attracts power. So it's more of a political thing, actually. Whoever defines the God idea or who can present the God idea very well controls a lot of people. So, and in history of religion, in our own history, especially colonial history, you find the God idea being used for one country conquering countries in Asia, in Americas, and so on. So in the Buddhist time, we have people who also use language to confuse others, to impress others. For example, we have Sanjaya, who was said to be the stupidest of all the philosophers because of the way he tried to hedge himself, tried to show his own philosophy. So when someone asks him about does the world exist or not exist, this is what he's recorded as saying. He says, if you were to ask me whether there is a world beyond or a hereafter, if I thought that it exists, I would declare to you it is so. But I do not say it is this, I do not say it is that. I do not say it is otherwise. I do not say it is not so. I do not say it is not so. All that you can say after that, say, huh? Right? It's mind-boggling, right? So he doesn't want to be caught in any kind of statement. So he says, I don't agree with all this. So any kind of question you ask him, he will give this kind of standard reply. You know? And it's just like one person, you know, he got very upset with the Buddha because the Buddha is very good in exposing all this wrong way of thinking. So one day he came to the Buddha and said, okay, I think I'm going to get you this time. No? I have no opinions at all. So now you cannot get at me. In one line, the Buddha got him. The Buddha simply said, to say you have no opinion is itself an opinion. And there you are, it's caught. So it's not so simple when we talk about, when we put all these ideas into words, right? So we can still see usefulness in language because that's how we communicate with people. But we must be clear in our language. We must be wise in using language, good and skillful in using it, and above all, we must be honest when we use language to talk about religion. In other words, we have to define things very carefully. And in religion, a lot of things appear to be what they are not. We have to understand them. In other words, when we put things together, they appear one way. But if you look carefully, they have other ways of seeing the same picture. This is called Gestalt, and you find in figure 225, this is an example of some Gestalt figure. Let me just show you. You can see here in this, I hope it's clear for you. Right, so this is, you can look at your book, figure 225. Now you see, for example, there's a triangle there and like three Pac-Man at each corner. Actually, there's no triangle there, but our eyes try to follow the lines, and then you see a triangle which is not present. So we often see things which are not there. That's called sankhara in Pali. And then you see a picture, this very interesting picture, an elephant here again. Can you see the elephant? How many legs does it have? Now we know elephants have 4 legs. But if you count, if you look carefully at this picture, there are at least 5 legs. This elephant has at least 5 legs. Our eyes have tricked us. We don't see 5 legs because in our minds, all elephants have 4 legs. So even when we see a picture, we say 4 legs. When you look carefully, actually there's 5 legs. And there's this famous rabbit picture, right? This picture B here. You can see this picture of a rabbit. So here, if you look carefully, it's a rabbit. You look another way, maybe at the end of the sharp point, it looks like a duck. So, is it a rabbit or a duck? It depends on your way of looking at things. There's a very important lesson to learn here. Religion is our way of looking at things. So we have to be a bit open about how we look at things. There's no one way of looking at things. That's called a view, right? True reality is something else, which we'll talk about another time. So here, the truth, in other words, is not just a view. The truth is this whole thing that we look at. Maybe we can't see it directly with our 5 senses, but it's there. So we must know how to ask the right questions so that we get to the truth, in other words. So we have to understand that there are certain things we cannot really put into normal human language. So we have to use what's called negative language or apophasis. Not this, not that. So nirvana is not condition. Nirvana is not this world, not the 5 senses, and so on. So that helps us also. So this is where, in other words, take for example the teaching on non-self, which is a very tricky one, and the Buddha answers differently for different people. One of the most famous way he answers was through total silence. There was this wanderer called Uttiya who asked the Buddha all these questions. The Buddha simply remained silent, didn't say anything, because this person is not ready at all. That's the true silence of the Buddha. Then there are occasions when, for example, with Vacchagotta, Vacchagotta, the wanderer, asked the Buddha, is there a soul, is there no soul? Both, neither. The Buddha says, no, I don't teach these things. These are undeclared questions, they have no answer. And then the Buddha explains why he doesn't answer. He says, this kind of questions does not help us to become a better person. This kind of question does not help us to work towards awakening in this life. That's why I've not taught those things. So when we talk about questions, for example, about the self, it's a very tricky situation. Of course, we say, yes, there is a self in a conventional sense. For example, I am here sitting talking to you. So when I say I'm referring to the 5 aggregates, which are all changing, so you must understand that, right? So the I is a short form, not the real thing. We can accept that, the world accepts that. That's called conventional truth. But on the other hand, there's no I, because everything is changing. I'm changing, right? I coughed a while ago, I'm not coughing anymore now. When I cough, part of me goes back into the air, and so on. And now I've drunk some water. So this water goes inside me, and it becomes me, right? So what am I really? I'm made out of 4 elements, and they're changing all the time. So where's the real me, right? So we can't really say anything useful there. So you have 2 answers here. Yes, there's the I, the one that's talking to you, for the sake of convenient conversation. And there's the other one, the higher reality. There's no self. So this is where to say there is a self is also wrong. To say there's no self also wrong. Because if you say there's a self, you're talking about, you are tending towards eternalism. If you say there's no self, they're tending towards annihilationism. So we try to avoid both. How? We just say These are terms we use conventionally to help us communicate and understand each other. So this is a very important way of listening and learning and teaching and conversing. Now there are other interesting points that you can look at, which I won't cover. I think that should be enough for today, for this lesson, where we talk about there are 4 possible alternatives. And when you talk about nirvana, we don't use this. It's very important also to understand that we don't say that nirvana is beyond all these 4 alternatives either. We can say that nirvana has nothing to do with language, which is fine. For example, when we talk about the self or the soul, we say that the 5 aggregates there's no self, no soul, right? Some people may have the wrong idea and think that there's a self outside of these 5 aggregates. But even that is not acceptable, right? So these are some simple ideas, some difficult ideas which we need to know so that we use language more clearly, more effectively when we talk about Buddhism or we talk about religion generally. So the next time we will discuss a bit about the 10 questions in some detail. So now I will end here by doing a short reflection. We have looked at the 4 alternatives, which gives us a grasp of how we can understand the nature of the human mind in dealing with truth and reality. These wonderful teachings have come down to us from the Buddha, and it is a great blessing to know all these wonderful teachings so that we are wiser and we can study the Dhamma more carefully and reflect on the Buddha's teaching more effectively. All this is good karma of the mind. By the power of this good karma, may we attain spiritual liberation, namely stream winning in this life itself. And in this moment of peace too, let us send out our loving kindness to all our teachers and friends, that they may be well and happy. And to those who have not seen or heard the Dhamma, they too may realize the Dhamma for their own happiness. May all beings be well and happy. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu.